This is Platform Diaries with Shane Williams, who chews the fat with entrepreneurs, startup founders and thought leaders on what it takes to traverse the wall between startup and scale up.
So what makes a great pitch? You're looking for investors' money, so you need to get it right. Dare I say, it must be pitch perfect. I'm Shane Williams, and welcome to Platform Diaries. Who better to turn to for pitching advice than Ferdi Reynolds? A seasoned founder come investor with SuperSeed Ventures in London, Ferdi has seen and heard them all, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Today, Ferdi tells me why a pitch is so important, the mistakes founders make when doing one, and his own secrets for nailing the pitch. I trust you'll enjoy the interview. So, Ferdi, welcome to Platform Diaries.
Thanks so much for having me on, Shane.
Mate, great to have you on as a guest, especially our first international guest for this season. I'll dive straight in and ask you a really sort of broad question, kind of get a bit of a sense of what we want to talk about today. And that is, what does it mean to make a good pitch?
So I like this question. I like it because it's kind of open-ended, and I feel there are a couple of important things to unpack when answering it. So the first part of it to me is, why should you bother making a good pitch? Why does it matter for your pitch to be good? And this might seem like a simple thing to address, but it seems to be something that a lot of people are still overlooking when applying for institutional funding. The level of competition and the level of saturation and number of people applying for the same ticket that you're applying for effectively is at an all-time high, unquestionably. Certainly, in Europe, the ecosystem is developing at a pace that we can't quite keep hold of. And really that makes the significance of the pitch so high, because you are, any VC worth their weight in salt is going to be reviewing at least tens of decks a day, probably more. And as a result, you've got to find a way to break through the noise. And so I guess the natural follow-on from that is, what does a good pitch look like? And I think that's probably going to be the basis of lots of the conversation that we have over the next however long we have the pleasure of speaking. So I won't unpack it too much. But I think there are two ways of thinking about it. There are things that you should try to do, and there are things that you should avoid doing. And I'm sure that you're going to steer the conversation in that direction very gracefully. So we'll get to address each of those things.
100%. So maybe we'll start with the good. Who's done it well, and why do you think it was good?
So I think, given the nature of the stuff that we invest in, I'm probably not allowed to give specific examples, but I can talk in sort of vague, abstract terms about what a good pitch has looked like to me. And I think some important context here is that the stuff that we invest in as a fund is rarely the stuff that makes the headlines. It's not the sort of consumer tech that commands these absurd valuations with, half a penny of revenue. The stuff that we invest in is the sort of unglamorous, unsexy stuff that is just quietly changing the way that the world works in the background, right? It's B2B tech. So it's super important, but it's not hugely sexy, I would say. And that means that when you're pitching, or rather when we're being pitched, we're quite frequently talking to people who have a sensible, robust business idea. They have a good grasp of what it means to build a business in a particular space. But it can sometimes mean that there isn't a huge amount of sort of personality shining through in the pitch. And I think that is a really clear example of something that really excellent businesses are able to do really well, is to express the very beginnings of a company culture before one is even really formed, in some cases before a company is even really formed, and getting that sort of personality to shine through and being sort of slightly ebullient, I guess, and interesting and drawing you in. But I think, lots of these businesses make sense, but it's about bringing your sensible, researched idea to life in a way that gets an investor excited, really. And so Dan, who's one of our partners, and I quite often talk about the fizz, which is that sort of ineffable sensation that just occurs to you when something feels right, when something feels exciting. And it's that sort of irresistible urge to smile as you start understanding the grasp, as you start understanding the potential of a business, right? And you share a knowing look between you and your colleague on the call, and you know that you're onto a winner. That's really the sort of feeling that you want to be conjuring in an early conversation with an investor. And that's, as I'm sure we'll touch on, that's not only to do with you being super upbeat and enthusiastic when pitching. It's also about sort of yes, answering direct questions and making sure that you're giving the right amount of information, but also leaving like an element of intrigue, right? Don't answer everything in the first call. Let the conversation flow naturally. So when people are sort of enthusiastic and up for it and energetic in a pitch, that really shines through.
All right. So then what do you think are the common mistakes that founders will make with their pitch?
So I think there's a very long list here. And that's, there's a very long list of founders. So of course there's a long list of mistakes. I've tried to condense them to the ones that we see most frequently. And one that I've left off my list, which has just occurred to me, is actually super important and is the number one reason that we turn down funding, is know which fund you're applying to and make sure that it's a good match before you apply to them. The number one reason that we reject businesses is because they're not on our model. And our model is quite specific, I guess, in that it's B2B technology, but it's also very public what we invest in. And we make we're not at all reserved about explaining our thesis and explaining what sorts of businesses we look at. It's all super public information. And I think that's true for most funds. So rule number one is, common mistake number one is applying to the wrong fund. And I think that's a really easy one to avoid. It's an easy way to claw back an hour of your life that you don't have to spend talking to a VC who won't be interested, which is, I'm sure, attractive to everyone. I think another classic mistake is assuming a level of psychological buy-in that you don't have until you earn. Practically what that means is sort of rambling through a pitch, sprinting ahead and making all sorts of assumptions that the investor is not only interested, but understands what you're talking about. And again, to bring it home to what we do, lots of the stuff, there's no way that I could possibly understand it because these sort of super domain expert and technical founders have discovered something pretty new. So there's no chance that I'm going to fully understand the meat of the conversation unless they really helpfully unpack it for me so that I can get up to speed. So don't sprint through a pitch and then sort of get to the end, draw breath and ask if there are any questions, because I think it's always better to check in and just make sure that everybody's up to speed. And I guess related to that is trying to secure funding from that first conversation. I think people are very circumspect about how long it takes to build a business, and everybody seems to be aware, or most people seem to be aware, that startups are very iterative and you don't make lots of progress very quickly unless you have the right foundations and you have to go step by step. But people sort of seem to forget that when it comes to fundraising, and the story is exactly the same. It's not an immediate process. It's not binary. It's not, are we getting investment from this conversation or not? It's a long, drawn-out process in which both entities are sort of feeling each other out and working out if it's going to be a good fit. And I think, really successful investments are partnerships rather than just an exchange of capital. And in order for that partnership to work, you have to really understand the energy in the room and who's who and what's going on and what the dynamic is between you two. And that takes time to form. So I guess that's another classic mistake, is trying to secure funding too early. The biggest one for me, I think, is death by slides. And death by slides has two facets. The first is a 30-slide pitch deck. 30 slides is too many. 20 slides is probably too many. I think there's a sweet spot, which is, somewhere between 10 and 15. And if you're putting more than that number of slides in a deck, you're probably trying to squeeze too much info into the deck. And again, this is related to the trying to secure funding too early or trying to progress the conversation too quickly. That pitch deck is only really there to get you on a call. Its whole sort of raison d'etre is to earn you a call with the investor. And if you're then trying to ramble on about your sort of, well, I don't know. I mean, I do actually quite like looking at sort of 2-year plans in a deck, but you don't want to run away with too much information and overwhelm an investor, because it's just a very easy way to get them to a position where they feel like saying no. And then death by slides V2, the sort of second element of it, is pitching at an investor rather than having a conversation, rather than opening a dialogue, just sharing screen, opening slides and going through that mammoth 30-slide deck. It's not an easy experience, and it's not very engaging. And as I was saying before, the best way to conjure that feeling of the fizz is to get people excited and to feel like they're a part of something exciting, and to feel a part of something, it needs to be a two-way street, really. And then I think the final thing that I would say on this, the final mistake that we identify and that we find a little uncomfortable, is bringing on a cast of thousands of people onto the call, and in lots of cases, bringing the wrong people onto the call. I think in these early conversations that you have with VCs or with any investors really, the only people that should be in those conversations, I would say subjectively, are the founders. I'm not hugely interested in the wider team until we've sort of tested the energy in the room with the founders, and a sort of matter of personal preference, which I know is shared by some people in the ecosystem, is I'm not a huge fan of having lots and lots of introducers on the call, because they have such a clear agenda, which is to kind of wrap up the fundraising nice and quickly. And it changes the way that the founders pitch, it changes the energy on the call or in the room. So it might be only me who feels this, but I certainly would say please leave the introducers off.
So what your job is done, you've made the introduction, now please sit in the background.
I think so, right? And I think ultimately it's always a difficult one, because they are playing an important role for the founders, who in most cases have taken quite a humble step in admitting that they need a bit of assistance getting from 0 to N. They need somebody to make that jump for them because they don't feel qualified to do it themselves. So that, I guess, is a good sign, because that humility is going to be important further down the line when you get knocked back. But I just think it's really noticeable. I mean, I don't know how many calls we do a week, but certainly dozens. And when you have a call where the founder and you are able to interact authentically, the amount of information that you unpack and the amount of energy that you're able to feel, I know that sounds very sort of pithy and very millennial, but it really does matter how quickly you're able to form a bond and some sort of relationship, even if it's quite superficial at first, with that founder. It's so important that you're able to do that early on. And generally what happens when there's an introducer there who is just sort of waiting to take their pound of flesh, forgive me any introducers listening, it just changes the energy in the room, and it becomes a conversation primarily about capital and when that investment's going to clear and what's your timeline and when can we expect term sheets. And it's just, these, yes, they're important considerations and every founder should be aware of those questions and it's right to ask them, but it shouldn't be the first thing on your mind. The first thing by far that you should be considering, I mean, the most important thing by far, is whether both sides feel like there's going to be a successful partnership. And that partnership goes way, way deeper than just cash.
So then I guess if I pull that together, it would be less is more in terms of who you bring. And then would it be safe to say you're looking for the first conversation just to see if there's a click before you go, all right, now I want to know what the process looks like? Is that a fair assessment?
It varies, I'm sure, from fund to fund. And I think we have a particular view on this because we are all ex-founders and not the sort of archetypal investor, not the typical investor profile in the UK, where only 8% of VCs have actually worked in startup. The vast majority of VCs in the UK are sort of ex-consultants and ex-bankers, and possibly have a slightly different diligence process. But for us, a hugely important part of our diligence process, and probably the most important part at the beginning, is how do we feel about this founding team? Do we feel that these are the guys who are going to conquer this market? Have they got the energy to deliver under the ambition? All of these sorts of things are pretty difficult, and they're not spreadsheetable, they're not modelable, they're all quite vague. And so it's hugely important to sort of get an impression for those things, to feel those things intuitively. And so, yes, I think it is one of the earliest questions. In fact, often the first question that we ask is, what's your origin story? What was it that made you leave PwC 8 years ago when you realized that you'd had a brainwave about how to develop a new HR tech or whatever it might have been? And that's when you really start seeing the personality, because it's rare that founders are given that opportunity to talk about their personal journey within a business. Most of the time, I think, I get the impression, most of the time when founders are talking to VCs, it's quite a formulaic conversation. It's quite a numerically driven conversation. So what progress have you made? What is your recurring revenue? Which are important aspects, don't get me wrong, like that stuff does matter. But I wouldn't say that it matters nearly as much as the personalities and the people behind the business. So that for us is always a really important thing to assess.
What do you think if you're a startup founder? I'm going to create an absolutely unfair stereotype, but let's go with like highly technical introvert, and I know I need funding. I'm particularly nervous about standing in front of people and talking at the best of times. How do you think you best handle that situation? Is it the introducer in the room? Is it the hire a pitch perfect type person? What does it look like?
It's a really good question, and I think there's a lot to it. There's a lot that one could say in response. I think so. The founding teams that we find most convincing are generally technical or domain experts, so super experienced or super knowledgeable technical founders who have then had the sort of, I don't know, the awareness or the humility to realize that they're going to need somebody to drive the business commercially. And we don't need to see that necessarily, when we're being pitched by a business, when a business is pitching to us. We don't need that commercial founder role to exist yet, but we need the technical founder just to be aware that it's a need that they have. So if the introversion is so strong that it's a really uncomfortable process for them to talk to people and they find it a very difficult process, maybe that's a justification to have an introducer, or maybe it's a justification to have somebody teeing up the call or making the call easier. But I think almost always people like that will be passionate about the sort of topic or the subject that their business addresses. And that's really our job, as the other people on the call. It's our job to make people pitching to us feel as comfortable as possible to tell their story, because that's all we really care about, is the story and what they're doing and what inspired them and what they noticed to come up with this earth-shattering business idea. So I think we would always have a role in that. And also whether it would be a worrying signal to us that somebody is sort of introverted and not hugely good at pitching. The short answer is no, because there's always somebody brilliant that you can hire to be noisy on your behalf and to go out and raise funds and go out and sell. And it's actually one of the sort of big value adds, in inverted commas, that we're very proud to offer is really helping technical and domain expert founders scale their business, so grow the commercial side of their business. And a lot of that is workshopping and conversations about brave new worlds and visions of a utopia after your new RPA business launches, whatever it might be. But I think there's an awful lot that we should be doing to make that conversation as comfortable as possible.
Yeah, so I think the technical founder, you're looking for them, I guess from the origin story, it'd be really interesting. It's almost like, how did you, as a domain expert, identify that there's an opportunity here? Because I'm guessing you want more than one opportunity through the life cycle of the startup, right? This is the first iteration of that idea. But if I have only one and will only ever have one idea, it's probably not going to iterate real well. I
think the idea is, this is one of my dad's favorite pieces of advice to trot out, is that it's 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration. I think an idea is such a small part of building a successful business, and it feels huge at the time, right? It feels like that idea is the reason that you leave your cushy job. It's the reason that you sacrifice your comfortable salary and decide to go and ask your mum and dad and Uncle Tom for 50 grand so that you can launch a speculative mission into space sort of thing. But I think, really the meat, the sort of really important aspect is the execution and how far and hard and whatever people are willing to graft to execute that fantastic idea, however fantastic it may have been. It requires a lot of hard work in the background to take it from 0 to 1. And I think we would want to see a business that would be an easy decision for us, is something that has gone through that very difficult process of and very expensive, by the way, process of sort of agnostic experimentation, working out whether it's this that we care about, whether it's this, but we care about this, but the customer cares more about this, and messing around and getting things wrong and breaking things and putting them back together with sellotape. And then eventually there's that moment, there's that click, and it on a graph it looks like an inflection point. In the room it feels like, oh my God, we've just unlocked something crazy here. And that's when you hit what we term as product market fit, right? When you can start seeing that you've got a repeatable, scalable model that all you need to do is pour petrol on the bonfire and we're off to the races.
Yeah, right. So I know we kind of touched on some of these points when we were talking about mistakes, but I'd be interested to get your perspective on like the pieces of advice you give founders to be successful with their pitch.
I think, look, this is going to be a continuation of some of the don'ts, inevitably. I think, as I hope is becoming quite clear, a really important thing for us is seeing people authentically and knowing who we're in the room with and getting an impression for what it would be like to work with somebody for 5 years, sort of thing. So we would really want to get to know the individual behind the business almost as much as the business. We're not quite going to be dinners every weekend, but we will be working in pretty close quarters for quite a long time, and there will be difficult conversations inevitably. So I think, be yourself. Don't hide behind a veneer, and almost don't be too professional. I mean, Dan, who is, as I mentioned, one of our partners, is, I hope you won't slap me for saying this, but is a very uncharacteristic VC type, in that he'll possibly swear too much on calls and be very fizzy and bubbly and incredibly warm and personable. And that really unlocks a lot of I've seen this with founders, it really unlocks and mitigates a lot of these sort of slightly rigid conversations that don't really unlock anything that valuable. They don't really reveal anything hugely insightful. Whereas when you've got Dan sort of fizzing around like a cocker spaniel on the other end of a call, it brings out this real sort of radiance and warmth in the conversation, and it helps us sort of see who the real person is behind the person behind the business. So that's always a really interesting thing. So let yourself be yourself and trust that it's an important thing for us to get comfortable on. I think the number one piece of advice that I would give, and that I know Dan gives a lot, and I know a lot of other investors try and work out how to phrase this, is just keep it simple. Dan says KISS, keep it simple, bracket stupid. I saw a post on LinkedIn the other day, ELI 5, explain like I'm 5. I always ask founders to explain it as if they're talking to a slightly simple 12-year-old, or like talking to their mate's mate in the pub for the first time. If somebody asks you what you do, I don't really want to know how your back end is configured. I really want to understand what your value proposition is, like what problem are you solving and for whom, And it's amazing how many founders or how many businesses sort of fall short of that, what I would hope is a relatively simple mark. You sort of get to slide 35 already exhausted and you still don't really know what the business does, or you've had half an hour conversation and you still don't know what the business does. And at the end of a process like that, you sort of wonder, do you know what your business does? Do you know who you're trying to serve and why you're trying to serve them? And quite often, you find out that the answer to that is no. But so I think be really simple, explain it as if you're talking to whatever the personality type is that it's helpful for you to envisage. I don't know, your grandma, your dad, whoever it might be, somebody who doesn't understand your world. Just make sure that we are up to speed with you before you sprint off and talk about really complex stuff. So keep it super simple, I would say, is the most important thing.
Mate, that's been really insightful, and I know we haven't got a lot of time left, so I'll just throw one last one at you, which I think is really important, which is what's next for SuperSeed Ventures?
Look, it's a really exciting time for us. So we, since I think 2018, have been investing out of our first fund, and then in January this year announced that we have first closed on our second fund. So what's next for us? Very simply, at the moment, we're sort of heads down, not only investing in the sort of really exciting businesses that we're seeing, but also trying to close the remainder of Fund 2. And, thereafter, I think there's a pretty simple mission for us, which is becoming the most prominent B2B technology investor at early stage in Europe. And I think that's a pretty achievable mission. It's a pretty underserved space. And it's something that we are incredibly passionate about. And as I've said earlier on, it's not always the sexiest space. It's not the stuff where you get, front page of all the tabloids, stories to make your mum proud and tell the neighbours. But these are the things that really change the world. The businesses that we invest in really, really change the world in ways that are imperceptible to most of the public. So what's next for us is really doubling down on that and hopefully launching many funds and bringing many, many technical founders to the forefront and driving that innovation forward.
Awesome. So if you're a technical B2B founder looking for funding only in Europe or anywhere in the world?
Not only in Europe. We have this slightly quirky requirement that our businesses have some presence in the UK, which for international businesses often means a substantial sales office, or it can be, we can have all sorts of conversations about re-domiciling the business as a UK entity, whatever it might be. The short answer is any business from anywhere is good. We want to hear from all B2B tech founders, even if it's just to understand the amazing things that are happening around the world. But I would encourage anyone to apply and to get in touch.
Ferdi, mate, we're up on time. I appreciate you spending the time with us and sharing your wisdom, and we'll catch up again soon.
Thanks so much, Shane. It's been a lot of fun.
You've been listening to Platform Diaries with Shane Williams. To find out about how Shane enables digital businesses to scale, please visit shanewilliams.com.au. Thank you for listening.